I'm Julie Morris from the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about African migrants in the Midwest. Migration, particularly immigration, is a topic of increasing interest in the world and in the United States. Since the flood of Syrian refugees began entering Europe and President Trump promised to build the wall on the southern border of the U.S., migration has received international attention. However, with this onslaught of news, we can often forget that each migrant has a different story, and that each place affected by immigration is a part of the greater migration discourse. For those of us in the Midwest, Europe and the southern border of the U.S. can seem distant. What is happening here? Let's talk about who is coming to the Midwest. The largest group of migrants in the Midwest is from Latin America, as you can see in this chart, followed closely by Asia. However, the proportion of migrants from Africa has increased since 2000, like no other geographical region. Much has been said concerning Latin American migrants in the U.S., but what about migrants from other regions in the world, particularly Africa? The United States does not receive a large number of migrants from Africa overall. However, since the 1980s, the number has risen dramatically. Likewise, more than the numbers are growing, African-born immigrants are claiming a larger proportion of the total foreign-born individuals in the United States. Let's look at the Africa-born population in the U.S. African migrants made up only 4% of the foreign-born population in the United States in 2010, and then up to 4.8% in 2015. However, the trends for the Midwest are more dramatic. In 2015, migrants from Africa made up almost 7% of the foreign-born population in the Midwest, up from just under 6% in 2010. Although these numbers are small, it's important to note that prior to 1970, migration from Africa to the United States was virtually non-existent. Since then, the African-born population in the U.S. has roughly doubled every decade. Something significant is going on with African migration to the U.S., and the Midwest is playing a crucial role in these migrant stories. Let's look at where the migrants are going in the Midwest. The U.S. Census recognizes 12 states as the region of the Midwest. Most of these are not the traditional migrant receiving states that we think of when we consider migration to the United States. Border states and states with large urban areas like Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, California are our traditional migrant centers. However, the numbers are changing. From the chart that you see, we can see that Illinois has the largest proportion of its population as foreign-born individuals compared with other Midwestern states, because Chicago has been a common urban hub for immigrant resettling, much like New York City and Los Angeles, Miami. However, if we break the foreign-born population down to see where African migrants are living in the Midwest, a new picture emerges. The chart that we're looking at now shows the African-born population in the Midwest as a proportion of the foreign-born population. If you'll remember from the last chart, Illinois had our highest percentage of foreign-born individuals all the way down to South Dakota, which had our smallest percentage of foreign-born individuals. But when you take into account the proportion of African-born individuals within this larger foreign-born population, you can see that the numbers are quite different. The national average is 4.8%, and many of the states in the U.S. or in the Midwest are greater than that. So why are Africans settling in the Midwest by the numbers that we see here, or by at least the proportions that we see here? There is no single answer to why Africans are settling in the Midwest. To understand the answer more fully, it's important to understand why Africans are coming to the United States. The Department of Homeland Security categorizes immigrants as they enter the U.S. Although these categories can be misleading in that some individuals would technically fit into more than one category, they can help make sense of the larger trends in African immigration. As the chart above makes clear, for the past decade and a half, the majority of African immigrants have been coming to the United States to join family members already here or as refugees. People in these categories are, therefore, not choosing their new home. It has already been chosen for them by family members or the U.S. government. For example, Minneapolis has a large Somali population, so as family members come to the U.S., most choose to locate there. Likewise, the U.S. prioritizes family reunification when issuing visas. Sudanese migrant Mona Ibrahim put it this way: "When I first thought about coming to the United States, the first thing that came into my mind was to go to a place where there was someone I knew. Since my brother-in-law was a student at the University of Iowa, Iowa City became our destination." For the resettlement of refugees, the U.S. government attempts to redistribute refugees to avoid being a burden on local economies and social services. Refugees are not to be, quote, placed or resettled in an area highly impacted by the presence of refugees or comparable populations unless the refugee has family in the area. Although refugees are often resettled in urban areas with local agencies and economies that have the experience and capacity to assist in the resettlement process, many refugees who may lack education or English skills are heading to small Midwestern towns to take advantage of meat processing plants that require an abundance of low-skilled labor. Garden City, Kansas is one of these communities that is being changed by migrant populations drawn in by work in meatpacking plants. This West Kansas community was in crisis, like many other small towns, due to dwindling population. Community, religious, and political leadership came together and decided that the town could be saved by the opening of a meatpacking plant. Today, the once predominantly white community is now only 40% white, as people, including many refugees, come from all over the world to work in Garden City. The population has increased dramatically and the town has new flavor, generally embraced by the town's original population. In 2015, over 20% of the population of Finney County, where Garden City is the county seat, was foreign-born. 4% of the foreign-born population was from Africa. The next question we should look at is, how do African migrants live? What do they experience? Despite the large proportion of African immigrants who enter the U.S. as refugees, African migrants tend to be highly educated. However, this fact does not always translate to high-paying jobs. In this chart, we can see the occupations of the Midwest population in 2015, comparing native-born individuals to foreign-born to African-born, and you can see the differences. Here we can see the 2015 earnings of Midwest populations. These charts show that even though African-born migrants tend to be more highly educated than other foreign-born migrants, as a group they bring in a lower household income and have a hard time breaking into the highest income bracket on the chart, as you can see here. Here again, we can see how African-born individuals compare with foreign-born and natives in their median household income. What countries are Africa-born migrants originally from? The top 4 countries represented by Africa-born migrants in the United States are Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Ghana, as you can see in this pie chart. The statistics in the Midwest are nearly identical. However, there are a few differences, namely there is a larger number of Kenyans and Somalians on average. Breaking this data down further to the state level, we can see from what countries Africa-born populations in each Midwestern state originate. The graph we see here shows the Midwestern states with the largest to the smallest Africa-born populations and shows the proportions of these populations by their countries of origin. As you can see, each state has a unique African migrant makeup. What these graphs overlook are the smaller communities of African nationals that make a significant impact on a smaller scale. For instance, Dosi, Rushabirwa, and Myers discussed the community of Tanzanians in Wichita, Kansas in their 2007 work called Tanzanians in the Land of Oz, Diaspora and Transnationality in Wichita, Kansas. Like many African-born migrants, Tanzanians in Wichita have formed an association to build networks with other Tanzanians in town and in adjacent cities. Since Tanzanians make up only about 1% of African-born immigrants in the United States, their stories and experiences fall below the radar of the greater trends seen in census data, like on this chart. On the other hand, the importance of the settlement trends of African immigrants is underscored in Hildebrand's paper, Unwitting Pioneers, Sudanese Refugees in the Midwest, from 1996. Hildebrand followed a family as they settled into a Midwestern community as the only individuals from South Sudan. The family goes through some unspeakable struggles, many related to their lack of community, and the wife eventually relocates to another city to be near family. Looking at the county level can be an interesting way to see where African-born populations end up. Typically, you'll find higher proportions of all migrants in large population centers. This is no surprise. However, if you look harder at the data for African-born individuals at the county level throughout the Midwest, you'll find, as we mentioned above, that counties with companies that require an abundance of low-skilled labor like meat packing plants will attract migrants. Pockets of diversity appear in counties such as Finney County, Kansas, Dawson County, Nebraska, and Buena Vista County, Iowa. Surprisingly, many low population counties in the Midwest have a small African presence. The table here shows what this phenomenon looks like in Kansas. More research is needed to find out about these pockets of African-born individuals in rural Kansas and why they are predominantly from South Africa. Let's look at some of the common characteristics of African migrants. For instance, the age breakdown. The age breakdown of Midwesterners shows that more Africans are aged 25 to 44 years than native-born and foreign-born people in the Midwest. In fact, the age breakdown for native-borns is flatter, showing a more even distribution of age throughout the population. One possible reason behind the unusual age distribution of African-born individuals relates to the type of person who migrates to the U.S. Typically, working-aged individuals come to the United States for better job prospects. Likewise, since African immigration has increased dramatically in the previous decades, the incoming population has not had much time to age past the prime working and migrating years of 25 to 44. The racial makeup of African-born Midwesterners is different from the total foreign-born population in the Midwest, not surprisingly, and more significantly is different than the native-born population of the Midwest. Interestingly, the racial makeup of African immigrants coming to the United States has changed dramatically over the past few decades. Prior to 1990, more Africans migrating to the U.S. were classified as white than black. Race plays an interesting role in the experience of African-born migrants in the U.S. today, a dynamic that still needs more research. For a deeper level of discussion about Africans in the Midwest, please see the annotated bibliography and then the larger bibliography provided on the Migration Stories website about African migrants in the United States. Thanks for listening.